Ah, the good life. Have you ever wondered why so many farms and homesteads, heck, even backyard gardens, only seem to last a couple years before they fold up? Well, I think it's about 90% just because they haven't taken the time to put things in the right place. So that's what I'd like to talk about. Zone and sector analysis are two terms made up by permaculture founder Bill Mollison to describe energy and help us put things in the right place. Zone analysis talks about our own energy and helps us conserve our energy on our property by putting things that we use the most often and that require the most care closest to the places that we visit most often. To do that, permaculture breaks down each property into 5 zones based on how often they're visited, with Zone 1 being close to the home and visited daily, and Zones 4 and 5 being rarely visited. In this series of videos, we're going to break it down by zones and talk about the best management and applications in each zone. Give you a lot of ideas. We're going to walk around here at Lillie House and see how we've applied zones on our own property, talk about how much they've helped us out, and hopefully some of these ideas will help you out too.
So, why do we need these zones anyway?
So the main example that's always given on zones is that vegetable garden that everybody has and puts it way back in the backyard, a freaking quarter-mile away from their house. Well, every day to work on the garden, it has to be a big production. They gotta put on their boots to walk out there, they got their gloves, they gotta carry all their tools out there, probably make a couple different trips to get all their stuff out there. And then they have to work, and if they have to harvest anything, they gotta take a couple trips to harvest back and forth, and so you know what? It just never gets done. When it comes time for dinner, you're thinking you know you got stuff out there, but be damned if I'm gonna take the trip and time to go out there to actually get the stuff. So it doesn't happen, and the garden rots and languishes, and nobody goes out to weed, and there's no garden. And next year, it becomes a plot of weeds.
So a zoned permaculture system turns that vegetable garden around and places it right where we're going to use it, by the front door, by the back door. When it's time to eat, we can just pop outside and grab our food. And while we're out there, we'll probably grab a few weeds too, and our work is done.
So obviously that's going to save you time and energy if you're not making all those trips out to the backyard. But what's underappreciated in a lot of circles is that zones aren't just a matter of saving us our time and energy, but they also are our first line of defense against weeds, against pest pressures, animals, and saving resources like water and fertilizer and compost. And they also are a number one way of saving us money. When it comes to weeds, what's interesting is that the more I research the history of agriculture and farming and the homestead pattern that seems to be found all over the world. And here's an example of that pattern from the study Home Gardens in Nepal by Rasham Gautam. And here we can see that this traditional pattern found all over the world, in it, proximity has been the first line of defense on pests and weeds. When it comes to weeds, the crops that require the greatest amount of weeding go right up by the home. They see them daily. If you need to, you can intervene before weeds get established, and they never have a chance. Crops that require less weeding go further away, and outside the homestead enclosure, the crops require very minimal weeding. For example, the Three Sisters Guild shown in the background of this image, or the forest garden coming in and establishing behind it. These are crop systems that require almost no intervention in terms of weeding. They pretty much take care of themselves, which is why they were favored by Native Americans. So in this way, we end up being able to focus our weeding energies on areas that actually need them the most, and we can prioritize what we're doing really naturally. And since the things that require the most care for weeding are right up by the house, they never have a chance to get established. The weeds do, because we're always right there, ready to intervene. And the same thing holds true for pests, where crops that tend to be the most favored by pests and by wildlife, you can put up really close to the house, where animals and wildlife are going to be naturally hesitant to be anyway. But then, since you have taken those things out and put them in a special place, then it's easy to surround them with a small fence or small gate type system, something that can exclude wildlife completely. And this is the only zone of exclusion that you need, but it can be for the crops that really need that exclusion.
Think again of that classic homestead pattern we looked at earlier. Here's an image of the same thing. It was a traditional pattern in Europe that became very popular in painting, the cottage garden pattern, or the Toft and Croft system of England. Just as in Nepal and throughout the tropics, in this medieval English recreation of a homestead, we see that same pattern, where proximity is used as the main deterrent for weeds and pests, with this fenced-in cottage garden close to the home. Beyond that, extensive systems of crops, including hedgerows, which were like the original forest gardens, and fields of grain crops, and really extensive agroforest systems such as coppice lots and pannage systems where they foraged animals. These more extensive systems required very little in the way of weeding or pest management.
Beyond that, zones have a major impact on our resource use, and we just can't really underestimate this. Same exact idea as with weeds and pests applies to resources like compost and water. Again, it's usually those same set of needy plants that the pests are going to be munching on and that the weeds are just going to be thriving in. These plants have been so cultivated for so long that they have very little natural resistance, very little vigor or fitness for existing on their own in an ecosystem. All their energy goes into being freaking awesome food, not into fighting off other baddies. So the same thing holds true with water and compost. They're the same plants that are going to require lots of compost and in some cases even daily watering to thrive.
So the main take-home here is that we can put plants that need daily watering in Zone 1 and plants that require less watering in Zone 3. We can actually pick the plants that go with the zone that we're working in.
So, as you see, it's saving us time, it's saving us water and compost, it's increasing our yields by helping us deal with pests and weed pressures. So what it's really doing is saving us money and increasing our hourly return on investment for whatever operations we're doing on site. Really, this is all just common sense, right? And yet, it's not something that we ever see put into use in our land use here in the United States. Nobody ever designs a subdivision and says, gee, we should put things where they make sense. We just simply don't do that. And yet, even in the permaculture movement, this idea of zones is often far underappreciated, perhaps more in the United States system than in other countries. I recently visited a permaculture farm. In fact, I visited several where they were doing lots of great permaculture stuff and lots of great sustainability efforts. And yet, they just really hadn't seen the value of zone analysis, primarily because they already had their system set up when they discovered permaculture. They weren't going to change everything around just to do this idea of zones when they already had their system going. See, and at this particular farm, the guy was doing lots of great stuff, I mean, I'm picking one out, but I visited a dozen permaculture farms like this, or farms doing a lot of permaculture that work just like this. But this guy just made it so clear, because at one point, he started to describe his day. And he said, first thing in the morning, I have to get up and I get on my quad. And I zoom out to where his animal systems were, way away from the house, all the way out in the extreme end of the farm. And there, he would feed his animals and do the animal work, check on them in the morning, do anything that needed to get done. But while he was out there, he said, I got to grab my eggs. So he grabbed his eggs, came back to the house on the quad, and cooked himself some breakfast. Next, there weren't any vegetables in his breakfast because he hadn't been out to the vegetable garden yet. So next, he had to get on the quad and drive out to the other side of the farm, because that's in the other direction, completely on the opposite far extreme end of the farm, is where his vegetable garden was. So he would work there through the morning, unless he had something else he had to do to check on the animals, in which case he'd go back to the animals. Maybe he'd go back to the vegetable garden again, most time that side or this side. Basically, all day long, he was driving back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And what you also get from this is the main source of irrigation water was up by the house. So he had just, I don't even know how many feet of hose he had running out all the way to his vegetable garden and through his vegetable garden. And because that amount of hose was extremely expensive, he had to choose generally cheap hose, it ended up leaking. It had leaks in several spots when I was there. So he was wasting a lot of the water that he was pumping. And meanwhile, he had to pay for all these hoses. And that day that I visited, the hose was actually leaking up by the house. And since he was driving back and forth and back and forth and back and forth all day long with the water leak, the area close to the house had become just this muck pit of mud, which was a problem all in itself. And if he needed to irrigate something out by the animal systems, where he was also establishing some trees, he'd have to grab all that hose and figure out how to run it all the way over there in the other direction. Or he'd have to buy that much hose and run it out there, again, as new hose. Meanwhile, he was hiring workers, and his workers would spend all day doing the same thing, running back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. They didn't have quads, so they were walking. So I figure he was probably paying his workers 50% of their wage just for walking around the farm. So I just feel like if he had done the work up front and done good zone analysis, he could have saved himself, 90%, 98% of the money that he spent on irrigation system, and he could have drastically improved his yields. He could have drastically cut the amount of money he was paying to his workforce. He could have instantly doubled his own income, because I bet he could have cut his own work time on the farm down by 50%, given all the time he was spending going back and forth. So what it really boils down to is that paycheck at the end of the day. Now here this guy was working his ass off, going back and forth all day long, doing a lot of work, putting in a lot of energy. That's a hard life. And meanwhile, 40 was getting a real low paycheck. He could have made his life a whole lot easier. So now look, I'm not going to tell you how to manage your own farm or how to design it. That's really up to you, unless you're going to pay me to do it. But what I am going to tell you is I like you too much to let you live that kind of lifestyle. Come on, nobody should have to live that way. So, I'm going to run you through zone analysis. We're going to go through one zone at a time. We're going to talk about what crops are appropriate, and we're going to tour around here at Lillie House and see how we've applied them here. So hopefully you can get some ideas about how you might want to do it at your place.